You think you have the power of choice. That's the first lie they tell you every time you walk into a grocery store. Look at the aisles. Hundreds of packages, dozens of brands, different colors, different logos, different promises. The feeling is one of abundance, of variety, of freedom. But strip away the veneer of that illusion, and what you'll find underneath is one of the most concentrated power structures humanity has ever built. And it isn't in parliaments, it isn't in diplomatic summits, it isn't in armies. It's in what you put in your mouth every single day. Behind nearly everything on the shelves of a modern grocery store, there are approximately 10 megacorporations. Just 10. And most of them aren't known to the average consumer because these companies don't need you to know their names. They only need you to keep buying. This is the silent monopoly, a system designed to be invisible, to operate in the shadows of the food chain, to control what enters your bloodstream long before you decide what goes into your cart. And the story of how this system was built isn't in nutrition books. It's in corporate records, in US congressional hearings, in studies funded by industries that paid to bury the truth for decades. It's also in the quiet mergers and acquisitions that rewrote the map of global food power without anyone ever issuing a press release. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single episode. Tell me in the comments, did you already suspect this level of concentration existed? And what city in the world are you watching from right now? There are two names you need to know to understand the foundation of all of this: Cargill and Archer Daniels Midland, known as ADM. You've probably never bought anything with those names on the packaging, and that's exactly why they're so powerful. Cargill was founded in 1865, shortly after the end of the American Civil War, when the United States was beginning its transformation into an industrial agricultural power. Its founder, William Wallace Cargill, started with a single grain warehouse in Conover, Iowa. For over a century and a half, the company grew almost silently, building a network of silos, ports, railways, and contracts that now spans more than 70 countries. It buys grain, processes animal proteins, refines oils, produces industrial ingredients, operates river transport fleets, manages port terminals, and finances farmers before the harvest even begins, creating a structural dependency that goes far beyond simple buying and selling. In 2023, Cargill reported revenues exceeding $177 billion. To put that in perspective, that figure surpasses the GDP of Portugal. The company has no publicly traded shares. You cannot buy a piece of it. The Cargill-Macmillan family controls the company to this day, and silence is part of the business model. ADM followed a similar trajectory. Founded in 1902 by George Archer and John Daniels, it specialized in linseed processing before pivoting to large-scale grain processing throughout the 20th century. Today, it operates in more than 170 countries, with facilities that process millions of tons of soybeans, corn, wheat, and canola per year. ADM was the central player in one of the sector's largest cartel scandals. In 1996, the company paid $100 million in fines to the U.S. Department of Justice for conspiring to fix global prices of lysine, an amino acid used in animal feed. The case was the basis for the 2009 film The Informant, starring Matt Damon. Together, Cargill and ADM form, along with two other companies, Bunge and Louis Dreyfus, what the market calls the ABCD, the quartet that controls between 70 and 80% of global grain trade. Bunge, founded in Amsterdam in 1818 and now headquartered in the United States, has a dominant presence in Brazil, where it operates dozens of ports and processing facilities. Louis Dreyfus, founded by Leopold Dreyfus in Alsace in 1851, remains in private hands and controls trade routes that cross every continent. But what do these companies actually do, in concrete terms, with all that power? They turned two ingredients, corn and soybeans, into the invisible pillars of virtually everything you eat. Corn isn't just the ear you boil on a Sunday. Industrial corn is the raw material for high-fructose corn syrup, the sweetener that replaces sugar in sodas, juices, breads, sauces, breakfast cereals, and hundreds of other products. It's also the basis for cornstarch, maltodextrin, citric acid, sorbitol, and dozens of other additives that appear on ingredient lists under names you don't recognize. Writer Michael Pollan, in his book The Omnivore's Dilemma, published in 2006, traced the origin of the ingredients in a typical American meal using carbon isotope analysis, and found that corn appeared in virtually every component, from the burger to the soda, from the special sauce to the bun. Soybeans, in turn, become lecithin, the emulsifier that gives chocolates and margarines their creamy texture, as well as vegetable oil, textured vegetable protein, and flour that makes up the animal feed that eventually becomes the meat you consume. Industry estimates suggest these corn and soy-derived components appear in roughly 75% of the processed foods sold in American grocery stores. And Brazil, as one of the world's largest producers and consumers of these commodities, is not immune to this logic. The model is perfect from a profit standpoint. Cargill and ADM buy corn and soybeans from farmers at the lowest possible price, process those raw materials into industrial ingredients, and sell them to the processed food giants, Nestlé, PepsiCo, Mondelez, Unilever. The farmer is left with the thinnest margin. The end consumer pays the highest price. The difference goes to these intermediary companies you've never seen advertised on television. In the card above, you'll find the episode on how Monsanto patented seeds and sued 140 farmers. Control begins even before planting, and that story is the origin of everything we just explained here. But controlling the raw material isn't enough. To ensure that consumers keep buying, and keep buying more, corporations needed something beyond distribution. They needed addiction. Not addiction in the metaphorical sense. Starting in the 1980s, major food companies began hiring neuroscientists, behavioral psychologists, and palatability experts to solve a specific problem: how to make consumers unable to stop eating. The technical name for the goal of that work is the bliss point, the exact balance of sugar, salt, and fat that maximizes sensory pleasure without producing genuine satiety. The concept was developed by psychophysicist Howard Moskowitz, who worked for companies like PepsiCo and Campbell Soup, refining product formulations until consumer response was maximized. Moskowitz called his own work product optimization, the corporate language for what is, in essence, the engineering of eating behavior. Journalist Michael Moss documented this process in depth in his book Salt, Sugar, Fat, published in 2013, drawing on internal documents and interviews with former scientists from these companies. What he found was deeply disturbing. Corporate meetings where neural response charts were presented like any other market data. Products reformulated dozens of times until they hit the exact point where the human brain loses its ability to say, "That's enough." Moss also documented that senior executives at some of these companies, people who knew exactly how the products were formulated, avoided giving those same products to their own children. Here's how the mechanism works. The human brain's satiety system was developed over millions of years to respond to real food, proteins, fiber, natural fats. When you eat an apple, the brain receives satiety signals before you've consumed too many calories. When you eat an ultra-processed product formulated at the bliss point, those signals are systematically bypassed. Sugar triggers dopamine. Salt amplifies flavor beyond what any natural food can achieve. Industrialized fat creates a texture the brain associates with pleasure without activating the stop mechanisms. The result is a product you literally cannot stop eating, not because of weakness of character, but because it was engineered for exactly that. Researchers at Yale University, using criteria adapted from chemical dependency diagnoses, developed the Yale Food Addiction Scale and found that compulsive eating patterns involving ultra-processed products show significant neurological overlap with substance dependency patterns. And this project wasn't limited to American and European markets. What did the corporations do when those markets began to saturate? They took the science of addiction to where it could still do the most damage. Nestlé and PepsiCo, among others, adopted a market penetration strategy targeting emerging markets: Brazil, India, Mexico, African nations, starting in the 90s and early 2000s. The tactic wasn't simply to sell products, it was to replace diets. Door-to-door salespeople in rural communities in Brazil and across the global south, offering credit to purchase baskets of ultra-processed products. Products formulated to be cheaper per calorie than traditional local foods. Marketing campaigns that associated ultra-processed food with progress, modernity, and aspiration, and traditional food with backwardness. An investigation by the New York Times, published in 2017, mapped Nestlé's strategy in Brazil, describing how teams of saleswomen traveled through riverside communities and towns in Brazil's northeast on boats and specially adapted vehicles, offering the company's products through informal credit arrangements. The effect was measurable. The World Health Organization documented the nutritional transition in developing countries. Within just a few years, communities that had never had significant rates of obesity or type 2 diabetes developed those conditions at epidemic scale. Local diets were gradually abandoned, and the competition, the small local food producer, was wiped out not by quality, but by price and access. This is not an accident, it's strategy, but control over product formulation and access to emerging markets still wasn't enough. To close the circle completely, corporations also needed to control the narrative, what consumers believed about health, nutrition, and choice. And this is where the story gets darker. In the 1960s, an American researcher named Onkel Keys published studies linking saturated fat consumption to heart disease. The best known, the 7 Countries study, compared cardiovascular disease rates with dietary patterns across different nations. The methodology was criticized by other researchers at the time, including statistician Jacob Yerushalmi, who noted that Keys had selected 7 countries from a universe of 22 available, choosing precisely those that confirmed his hypothesis. But Keys had charisma, political connections, and unrestricted access to the most respected medical publications. Fat became the #1 public enemy of American nutrition. What subsequent investigation revealed was that the American sugar industry, represented by the Sugar Research Foundation, paid Harvard scientists in the 1960s to publish reviews that minimized the role of sugar in heart disease and maximized the role of fat. The funded researchers included D. Mark Hegsted and Frederick Stare, 2 of the most influential nutritionists in the United States at the time. Internal documents of those transactions were discovered in historical archives and published by the journal JAMA Internal Medicine in 2016 by researchers at the University of California, San Francisco. The names of those funded, the amounts paid, equivalent to approximately $50,000 today per researcher, the communication strategy. All of it was documented on official letterhead. The effect was historic. The government food pyramids of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the ones every child learned about in school, were drawn with fat at the top as the villain and refined carbohydrates at the base as the foundation of a healthy diet. Low-fat products multiplied on the shelves, packed with added sugar to compensate for the lost flavor. And while governments were fighting fat, the epidemic of obesity and diabetes exploded in precisely the countries that most closely followed those guidelines. The funding of science to produce desired results didn't stop in the 60s. To this day, major food corporations sponsor university chairs, nutrition research foundations, and scientific conferences. A study published in 2016 in the Annals of Internal Medicine analyzed research funded by the beverage industry and concluded that studies with corporate funding were 5 times more likely to find no association between sodas and obesity than independent studies. Coca-Cola funded for years an organization called the Global Energy Balance Network, which promoted the thesis that physical inactivity, not sugar consumption, was the primary driver of the obesity epidemic. The existence and funding of the network were exposed by the New York Times in 2015, and the organization was shut down shortly after. But scientific corruption is only part of the equation. The control over what reaches you in the grocery store goes beyond the laboratory. There is a practice called the slotting fee, a positioning charge, that determines which products appear on shelves at eye level, which ones end up near the floor, and which ones simply can't get into major retail chains at all. To secure prime placement in chains like Walmart, Carrefour, or Whole Foods, manufacturers pay amounts that can reach millions of dollars per product, per chain, per market. These amounts are routine for megacorporations. For a small regional producer, they are insurmountable. The practice was investigated by the U.S. Congress in 1999 hearings when small manufacturers testified about the barriers that slotting fees represented for new competitors. No significant legislation was passed. The system continued. The result is that the grocery store aisle, the one that appears full of choices, is, in practice, an auctioned space. The products that reach you aren't necessarily the best or the healthiest. They are the products of the companies that could afford to pay to be there. And when some smaller brand manages, despite everything, to build enough of a reputation to threaten the majors, the next step is already in the playbook. The strategy of acquisition and absorption is documented, repeated, and perfectly legal. Nestlé bought Gerber, Purina, Häagen-Dazs, and dozens of other brands that consumers associate with quality or a specific niche. Unilever controls Ben & Jerry's, the ice cream shop that started in a converted gas station in Burlington, Vermont in 1978, and became a symbol of conscious capitalism, along with Dove, Hellmann's, and hundreds of others. PepsiCo bought Naked Juice, a brand that sold natural and pure juice, and later became the target of a lawsuit for false advertising, when it was proven that some products contained genetically modified ingredients. Coca-Cola bought Honest Tea, founded to offer an alternative to the industrialized beverage market, and also Vitamin Water, whose legal proceedings over unproven health benefit claims dragged on for years. The pattern is always the same. The alternative brand grows by offering something genuinely different. The mega corporations watch it grow. When the price is right, they buy. The name and the packaging remain, but the formulation may change, production costs are cut, and the profit is redirected to the same group that controls the very products that brand claimed to stand against. What this system has produced, in human terms, is one of the greatest public health crises in recent history. The World Health Organization estimates that more than 1 billion people live with obesity. Type 2. Diabetes affects more than 500 million adults worldwide, and the projection for 2045 exceeds 780 million. In the United States, according to the CDC, more than 70% of adults are overweight or obese, and roughly 38 million people have diabetes. The direct cost of these conditions to public and private health systems amounts to hundreds of billions of dollars per year. Who foots that bill isn't the corporations that profited from selling the products that contributed to those conditions. It's governments through public health systems. It's individuals bearing the cost of medications, treatments, and years of lost life. The externalities, the economic term for the costs a company generates but doesn't pay, are thoroughly socialized. And here is the irony that sums it all up. Some of the world's largest corporations simultaneously hold ultra-processed food divisions and pharmaceutical divisions, or have stakes in companies that produce the drugs used to treat the very conditions those foods help cause. Nestlé has a division called Nestlé Health Science that sells clinical and nutritional products for patients with diabetes, obesity, and metabolic diseases. while other divisions of the same company sell chocolates, sugary cereals, and sodas. The investment funds that hold significant stakes in PepsiCo and Coca-Cola are the same ones that hold significant stakes in major pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, Merck, and AstraZeneca. Vanguard and BlackRock, the two largest asset managers in the world, consistently appear among the largest shareholders of both the leading food corporations and the leading pharmaceutical companies. You don't need to posit a coordinated conspiracy to see what this model represents. The problem isn't the individual bad faith of specific executives. The problem is that the system was built in such a way that profiting from disease and profiting from treatment are perfectly complementary businesses, and both are, more often than not, in the hands of the same investors. The silent monopoly isn't just about your money, though it takes a good portion of it every time you go to the grocery store. It's about something more fundamental: the gradual, deliberate reshaping of your biology, of your preferences, of your perception of what is normal to eat, of your ability to feel full, of what you teach your children to want, of the line between food and industrial product, a line that was erased so gradually that most people never noticed it existed. The corporations that built this system didn't do it in secret. They did it in plain daylight, with public records, with lobbyists in Washington and in state capitals, with documented scientific sponsorships. The silence didn't come from them. It came from complexity, from the sheer volume of information, from the speed with which daily life consumes the attention of those who should be paying attention. And it came from a fundamental asymmetry. The corporations have decades of strategic planning, legal teams, public relations departments, and billions in resources. Every generation has its own invisible empires. The names change, the mechanism doesn't. And the first step toward not being governed by a system you can't see is learning to recognize where it actually is. If this episode made you see something you weren't seeing before, subscribe to the channel. Every episode here is one more layer of this same system being exposed. Leave a like if this story surprised you. And tell me in the comments, which of these companies shocked you the most to learn about? Which corporation today do you think is doing the same thing, just in a way we haven't caught on to yet?